What is up, everybody? Welcome back. Today we've got a video going over some poker lingo terms and definitions. I've seen some misuse of some terms or just people not having seen a bunch of these. So we're going to go through a bunch of different poker terms today. Obviously, this is a very simple format. We've just got a Google Doc here with a bunch of different terms and their definitions, including some examples. So let's jump right in. First one we're going to go over is straddle. A straddle is a third blind. Sometimes this is optional, sometimes it's mandatory, depends on the game you're playing in. It's mostly posted from under the gun. There are some places that'll allow you to button straddle, but pretty much everywhere allows you to straddle from under the gun. So, for example, in a 2-5 game with a straddle, normally the straddle is two big blinds, so this would be 2-5-10 posted from under the gun. When there is a straddle, the player to the straddle's left acts first pre-flop. So if you are button straddling, the small blind is actually the first one to act pre-flop. This completely screws both the small blind and the big blind, especially the big blind. And it's a huge advantage for the button in most scenarios, which is why most places don't allow you to button straddle. The under the gun straddle is not exactly great. It's not plus EV for the under the gun player. So if you're in a game and the whole table isn't straddling under the gun, I wouldn't recommend it. But button straddling is actually quite nice because you get to bloat pots when you're playing in position, especially when the other players at the table aren't straddling from the button. So again, it's kind of rare to see a button straddle, but when it is available, it's pretty advantageous for the button. But because of that, sometimes it's a little frowned upon. But anyway, a straddle is a third blind. This is not a raise, keep in mind. So if you're playing in a game with a straddle, don't limp the straddle, certainly from early position. When you raise over the straddle, that's not a 3-bet, that's just a raise. And you want to adjust your sizing accordingly. When you have this third blind in play, your stacks are effectively half as short. So we'll get into some more of that stuff later. But if you're playing 2-5 and someone puts on the straddle to 2-5-10, the big blind is now $10, not $5. So if you sat down with 1,000 and you initially had 200 big blinds, if the $10 straddle is on, you now have 100 big blinds. So you should be playing accordingly for 100 big blind stacks. Anyway, next we've got VPIP. This is probably the most common poker stat. This stands for voluntarily put in pot. This is the percentage of hands that you're playing either by limping, calling, or raising. All of those count towards your VPIP. Optimally, this would be around 20%. It changes a little bit depending on like the rake structure and how many players are at the table, but somewhere around 20% is good. Next, we've got pre-flop raise, which is both a stat and an identification of a player. So PFR is a stat that is the percentage of hands that you're raising pre-flop. Again, this would be just barely under your VPIP. There are definitely going to be some hands that you're calling, like from the big blind or maybe the button. But as you've heard me preach, 3-bet or fold is good from a lot of different positions. So if you're playing, tight and aggressive, your PFR is going to be just barely under your VPIP. And PFR also refers to preflop raiser, who is the person that raised preflop. So if you're playing postflop and you're referring to someone as the PFR, that is the person that opened the action preflop or placed the last raise. So like, let's say it's a 3-bet pot. This would be the 3-better. SRP is single raised pot. So not a 3-bet pot, not a 4-bet pot, etc. Sometimes this is also often called a 2-bet pot, but that's really rare. You'll pretty much only ever see that in like a solver that is categorizing spots into like 2-bet, 3-bet, 4-bet pots. Nobody ever really calls single raised pots 2-bet pots, and nobody ever really calls a preflop raise a 2-bet. So again, the only time you'll ever really see this is like if hands are categorized online or something. Next, we've got effective stack. This is the smaller of the two stacks in play in heads up play. So like, let's say I have 100 bigs and you have 50. Obviously, we can only play for the 50 in your stack. So whether I have 51 big blinds or 1,051 big blinds, your stack is the effective stack, and that's all the big blinds we can get in there. So the bigger of the two stacks doesn't matter how big it is, as long as it's over the smaller one. SPR, not to be confused with SRP, which is single raise pot. SPR is stack to pot ratio. This is the size of the pot divided by how much is in the effective stack. So you'll often hear people talk about different hands playing well with high SPR or low SPR. What they're talking about is how much is left in stack compared to the size of the pot. So, like, let's say you're on the river, there's $500 in the pot, and the effective stack is $500 on the river. Your SPR is one. You'll run into spots like this with really low SPR. Like, one is a very, very low SPR. You'll run into spots like this in four bet pots or straddle pots where there's a three bet or a four bet, where you're going to the flop and you four bet pre-flop and you have one pot size bet remaining in your stack. That would be an SPR of one. Most of the time when people are talking about hands playing well with high or low SPRs, they're talking about like low suited connectors and things playing best with high SPRs, or like suited aces and things like that, where bigger cards like Broadway cards will play better with a lower SPR. So, like, if you're, this is certainly relevant in tournament situations where, like, if you have 15 big blinds, I'd much rather have ace king off, where if you have 400 big blinds, I'd much rather have like ace four suited. Anyway, that's what SPR is referring to. What is a three bet? A three bet is raising a re-raise. This is a little bit different pre-flop and post-flop. So pre-flop, the big blind is considered a raise. So any raise on top of that is a re-raise or a two bet, and then an additional raise would be a three bet. So an example of this pre-flop would be, let's say under the gun opens to 15 and the button three bets to 50. So the first bet there is the big blind. The under the guns open is a two bet or a raise, and then the button's raise to 50 is the third bet. Post flop, this is a little different because the big blind isn't in there, so you're starting from the first bet. So a three bet post flop would be the third bet on the same street. So an example of that would be, let's say we have a pot where under the gun C bets the flop for 15. The button raises to 50. This would be the second bet. And then under the gun re-raises to 160. So again, under the gun C bet, button re-raise, under the gun three bet to 160. This 160 would be the third bet. Post flop, three bets and four bets are very rare, but you do see them sometimes. What is a squeeze? A squeeze is a three bet after a raise and a call. So different than this situation here, where this is just essentially heads up action pre-flop, where you've got the under the gun and the button player. In a squeeze spot, you'd have a call between those. So under the gun open to 15, the hijack calls 15, and the button three bet squeezes to 65. You'll see good players squeeze quite often. This is one of the reasons why playing three bet or fold is so effective, is because this hijack player is now going to get priced out of a lot of pots. If the button player or whoever is squeezing is using good sizes, this is going to make it really difficult for this player to play post flop. Another reason the button is very incentivized to squeeze is because the under the gun player now has the hijack behind them to worry about. So they're going to have to defend tighter because they have another player still in the pot left to act. It would be rare for this person to then re-raise themselves. That would be a back raise, which we'll get to later. But still, it just makes under the gun's life a little bit worse having the player behind them. Either, this player could back raise if they wanted to, or this player is often going to go three ways out of position if they call, because now the hijack player is getting a really good price. But anyway, a squeeze is a three bet after a raise and a call. What is a cold call? A cold call is calling a re-raise as your first action. So having not entered the pot, calling a re-raise. So pre-flop, this would look like under the gun opening, button three bets to 50, and the small blind, who hasn't acted yet, calls the three bet. Obviously, posting the small blind doesn't count as an action, so this would be a cold call. Cold calling is very bad in almost every situation. You'll often see very weak players cold call three bets, or even more rare is cold call a four bet. Cold calling often indicates a very narrow range of marginal hands, which makes the person's range really weak. So often in a situation like this, where in live poker you'd see someone like cold call the small blind here, this person has like pocket nines all the time, or like some sort of like Jack 10 suited type thing. that they don't want to fold, but isn't strong enough in their mind to cold four bet. Um, but good players in this situation are always going to play cold four bet or fold. They're never going to be calling three bets cold, certainly never calling four bets cold. The cold just referring to the fact that they haven't entered the pot yet. But this is a huge leak. Again, this player is now super incentivized to squeeze both of these players because this person never has a strong hand because they cold called. And now this person is in a bit of a worse spot because they still have the third player left in the pot. This scenario is a little bit better for the button than the previous scenario because this guy gets to play in position, where previously we were talking about an under the gun player having to play out of position. But anyway, this under the gun player is going to be incentivized to four bet here quite a bit, given the extra dead money that's now in the pot from the small blind cold calling. So, long story short, don't cold call. It's really bad, and good players are going to attack it a lot. So, what is a cold four bet? It would be if this small blind player four bet instead of calling. So, similar example, we got under the gun open, button three bet, and then the big blind cold four bets. Cold, again, this player hasn't acted yet. Posting the big blind doesn't count. So their first action is a four bet. This is how good players are going to play from the big blind, fold or four bet. So, if you have aces here. Also, actually, one thing to note, I said this player's got like pocket nines all the time. You will find sometimes people have like aces here and they're like trapping by cold calling. Really, really bad. Don't do that. But this is how good players are going to play strong hands from the big blind here. Obviously, because, again, the SPR is going to be really low, and because you have to use big sizes here, this is going to be a really tight range. They're not going to be messing around with a bunch of trash, cold four betting from the big blind, especially versus an under the gun open. But when they do have those strong hands that they want to continue with, they're going to do it through a four bet. So this is a cold four bet. Very strong range, especially given these positions. An overcall. An overcall is calling a bet after at least one person has called before you. So this can be either pre-flop or post-flop. So over pretty much just means like do it after someone's already done it. So this can be overcall. It can be over limp. So like let's say you're in the small blind and there are 5 limps and you limp the small blind. That's an over limp because somebody's already limped before you. If it folded you in the small blind and you limped, that's just a limp. But an overcall example, under the gun open to 15, the cutoff calls, and now the button also calls. The button's call is an overcall because there's a call before them. A double call is a little bit different. A double call is calling a raise and then calling a re-raise. So under the gun opens at 15, the hijack calls the 15, then the button squeezes, and now the hijack calls again. So the under the gun player has not double called because they are the initial raiser who opened to 15. But the hijack player has now called twice. They've called the 15, and now they're also calling the 65. Again, this is a very weak range. If the hijack player had a strong hand, they would have 3-bet themselves. But now they're getting a very good price because the under the gun player has called this squeeze. So this is why sizing for squeezes is so important. So you'll often see players that kind of have the right idea about what to do, but not really sure on sizing. Here, they'll just 3-bet to like 3x, which is terrible because now once the so like let's say the button squeezes to 45 and the under the gun player calls. Now this player only needs to call 30 more and there's already like 105 in the pot. Their price is just insane and they're going to call a ton, especially because they get to play in position against the under the gun player. So this is why sizing is really important in 3-bets. You got to be 3-betting larger when you have calls in there. Certainly when you have more than one call. If there were like 2 calls or 3 calls in here, the 3-bet has got to be really big, specifically because of the price that these players are going to be getting. But anyway, the hijack player calling both of these raises would be a double call. Indicates a pretty, again, marginal range. A back raise. All right, so I briefly mentioned this earlier, but back raising is re-raising yourself after having called a raise on that street already. So And under a pre-flop example here would be under the gun, open to 15, hijack call, button 3-bet. Under the gun calls, and now hijack raises. So the hijack started with a call, and now they decide to raise. So again, they call a previous raise and now decide to re-raise themselves. This is really rare. A lot of the time when you see this, it'll be like a limp back raise. So someone from under the gun, you'll see this a lot with like weak, low stakes live players, is they'll like limp under the gun. Someone will ISO, which is raising over a limp, normally to a bigger size, to isolate. The ISO means isolate the limper, to play a heads up pot against the limper. So let's say like under the gun limps, someone ISOs the limp, someone now 3-bets, and then the limper limp 4-bets. That's a back raise. So that is often like aces and kings for really weak live players. It's kind of a rare play. There are spots in tournaments where it can make sense, but it's very rare to see a back raise. What's not rare is a continuation bet or a C bet. You'll hear this term all the time. This is super common. This is when the pre-flop raiser bets the flop. So obviously, when you raise pre-flop, you're going to do a lot of betting on the flop. I do a ton of betting on the flop. So if you watch my play explains and stuff, my C bet percentage is through the roof. There are reasons for that I won't get into right now, but there can also be delayed C bets on the turn. This is mostly when the flop checks through. So like, let's say I open under the gun, the big blind calls, I check the flop, he checks back, and now I bet the turn. I'm C betting. That's a delayed C bet on the turn. But yeah, C betting the flop when you are the pre-flop raiser. Lead or donk. These have slightly different definitions, but they go together. So leading is betting when out of position. Donking is betting when out of position into the aggressor on the previous street. So like, let's say under the gun opens to 15, the big blind calls. Then on the flop, instead of checking, the big blind bets. This is a donk or a donk lead. There are times when this makes sense, but it's very rare. I play no donks myself. And there are very, very specific scenarios where this makes sense. A lot of the time, it makes no sense. You'll see this live all the time, where people don't really understand like the dynamic of the game, and how ranges work, where they'll just like randomly donk some weird ace high flop because they have an ace, or they'll like flop third pair and they won't want to face a big bet, so they'll just lead for like really small. Again, won't go down the like strategy rabbit hole of how to play against it, but raising against this in live poker is often a very good way to combat it, or just straight up folding when you have no equity. But anyway, yeah, donking, pretty much an immediate sign that someone doesn't really know what they're doing. But yeah, overbet. This is a bet that's bigger than the size of the pot. So, simple example: you get to the river, the pot's $200, someone bets $250. An overbet can be anywhere over the size of the pot. So this could be 201 or it could be 2000. Anywhere over the size of the pot is an overbet. Good players will do this a lot, but you'll also see bad players do this sometimes. You'll see this a lot in like limped pots in live poker, where it'll be like 4-way limp pot at 2-5, where the pot's $20 going to the flop, and then someone just bets 25 on the flop, and they're clearly not calculating how much money's in the pot, or they just don't care, or they're just saying like, they just look at their hand and say, oh, I have a strong hand, I'm going to bet big, or this pot's too small for my liking, I'm going to bet 25. But if it's over the size of the pot, it's an overbet. Again, there are ways to play against this. Block bet. This is a small bet by the out of position player, usually a third the size of the pot or less. Blocking in position doesn't really make any sense, but there are a couple of reasons for a block. Sometimes it's because the out of position player doesn't want to face a big bet from the in position player, or sometimes it's because they want the in position player to raise, thinking that their small size conveys weakness. So sometimes there are times where you have a hand that is close to being able to value bet, but it's hard to get called by worse. So you block to use a small size to try to get called wider. Or if you have the nuts and either you think the in position player is going to check back, or you think um, they'll just like attack your small sizing a lot, you can block to try to induce them to raise, thinking that you have one of those marginal hands that is trying to get called by worse for very thin value. So there are a couple of different times where block betting makes sense, but it's a small bet by the out of position player. Range advantage, another important concept. So this is when one player's range of hands has an equity advantage over the other player's range. So this advantage gets larger on different flops as you, or different boards, as the ranges get more different from each other. So an example would be under the gun opens in a 9-handed game. This would be a really tight range, and the big blind calls. This would be a very wide range. The flop is ace king deuce. Under the gun here, because they have such a tighter range, has a range advantage on this flop. They have a ton of strong hands here, where the big blind is going to be three betting a bunch of their hands that interact well with the ace and the king. So the under the gun player just has a higher density of hands in their range that interact with this board and make strong hands. So like the big blind is going to have like 6-5 suited, which is nothing on this board, or 9-8 suited, or all this stuff that just has absolutely nothing, where that's a large percentage of their range of hands, where the under the gun player, because their range is so tight pre-flop, such a high portion of it makes a strong hand on this flop. So they have a range advantage. What is nut advantage? This is when one player's range has more nutted hands than the other player. So again, same scenario, under the gun opens 9-handed, big blind calls, the flop 6-5-4. Now aces is no longer the nuts. The nuts is 8-7, or any set here is essentially nutted. So the big blind is going to have a lot more nut hands than the under the gun player. So the under the gun player has a bunch of like aces, kings, queens, ace, king, ace, queen, that type of stuff, which is not doing too well on this board, especially against the big blind's range. The big blind has a ton of stuff between like 8 and 3 in their range. So they're going to have a bunch of two pairs, bunch of sets. The under the gun player 9-handed isn't even going to be raising all of these pocket pairs pure. So like probably have sixes most of the time, but they're supposed to be folding pocket fours from under the gun 9-handed, where the big blind is going to be calling obviously all pocket pairs, all two pair combinations, all sets, all straights, maybe with the exception of 7-3. So like, and probably three deuce, but like they have 8-7, they have 6-5, they have 5-4, they have 6-4, they have pocket sixes, pocket fives, pocket fours, all this stuff that has aces and kings beat. So on this board, the big blind has the nut advantage. What is board texture? This is how connected a board is. Often described as wet or dry. So a wet board is very connected, a lot of draws. A dry board is disconnected. So an example of this, if you've got Jack 10-8 with a flush draw, that's a very wet board, tons of draws, a lot of hands that connect in some way with this board, whether it's via a pair or a draw, or some sort of equity picked up on this board texture, where like King 7-3 rainbow, there's no like open enders here. There's no flush draw. This is a very dry board, so not a lot of draws and a lot of hands that just completely whiff. Polar is a concept that pretty much means a range is consisting of very strong or very weak hands. So this is often, polar ranges often use really large bets and take polar lines, meaning, they're using overbets and things. So when a player overbets, they're essentially repping a polar range, or they're polarizing their range, meaning they're representing really, really strong hands or absolutely nothing. So overbets or really large bets are often done with hands that are effectively the nuts, or if it's on the river, hands that are really, really weak. So things like second pair is not going to use overbets or large bets because it's not strong enough to take such a polar line. Where the opposite of polar is essentially like having marginal hands and using small sizes and things like that, trying to get called by worse. Polar lines are essentially saying I have the nuts and I want to get my whole stack in there. So they use very large bets. Equity. Equity is essentially how likely your hand is to win the pot. So this can be in relation to someone's hand or to their range. So if you're playing poker in real time and you don't know what your opponent's hand is, let's say you have a straight draw and you have, an open ender with, 8 outs. Your equity is how likely are you to hit those outs, assuming that those are the only cards that will give you the winning hand. If you are watching a live stream or something and they have both players' hands displayed with the little percentage next to them, that's how likely each hand is to win. So in either case, this is how likely your hand is to win the pot. When you compare this to your pot odds, you can determine whether you should be calling, folding, things like that. So equity goes hand in hand with this next one. Pot odds is the price you're being laid by an opponent's bet. So this is calculated as the pot size divided by the bet size, or how much is in the pot divided by how much you need to call. So let's say there's $10 in the pot on the flop, and your opponent bets $5, half pot. Now there's $15 in the pot, the size of the pot plus your opponent's bet, which is now in the pot, and you have to call 5. So this gives you 3-1, which as a percentage is 25%. How does this connect to equity? If you have more than 25% equity, this is a call. If you have less than 25% equity, it's a fold. This is more relevant as you get to later streets when your equity becomes more clear. Meaning like on the flop, there are some hands where you don't really know what your equity is, where on the river, it can be quite clear, when you're playing the turn and you have an open ender, like you need to get there or you don't have the best hand type thing, where on the flop, you can have like a weak top pair that might be the strongest hand right now, but by the river you don't know. So using pot odds and equity to decide how to proceed on when facing bets is something that good players do all the time. And it's, calculated by having an idea of what your opponent's range is in your head and then kind of applying both of these things to know how to proceed. Another thing good players use is blockers. A blocker is a card that essentially influences what your opponent can be holding. So let's say I have aces. I block ace king because I have 2 aces in my hand. Or in the most extreme example, I block aces because I've only left 1 combination of aces left in the deck if I have aces. So the opposite of this would be unblocking. So just not blocking. So like, let's say I have pocket 6s on the river and I think my opponent will bluff all of their Broadway hands. So like ace, king, ace, queen, king, queen type things. I unblock those hands because I don't have any Broadway cards in my hand. So you'll get into spots like this where, a straight will complete on the river or something, but you have, like, let's say Jack 10 is a straight, but you have a 10 in your hand. You block the straight. Or like if you have ace king with the king of hearts and there's 3 hearts on board, you block the nut flush. Good players are using this all the time to, make little adjustments in their equity and their opponent's equity to play accordingly. So when you talk about hands being like good to bluff or things like that, a lot of that has to do with blockers or unblockers. Sometimes people will say like, how can your hand be good to bluff? Like you need to be using the cards in your hand if you're bluffing to block or unblock certain hands that your opponents can have. Obviously, it doesn't make it impossible. If I have aces, my opponent can also have aces, but the huge drop in likelihood of that changes equities a lot. So it's very important to use blockers and to understand blockers, but that's essentially what they are. Now we've got a couple player types here. First, we've got lag, which stands for loose aggressive. A whale is the extreme form of a lag, so someone who will almost never fold, which is the loose part, and will bet a lot when they sense weakness, which is the aggressive part. Whales are always the best kind of players to have at your table because you can win a lot off them very quickly, and they're somewhat easy to play against when you're using things like equity blockers and pot odds to play correctly against them. There are a lot of these players can be very difficult to play against because they are so aggressive. But those styles of play aren't as complicated as a lot of people make them seem. How do you exploit someone that bets a ton and bets really big? Just fold a lot. It's not it's not about like bluff catching all the time and whatever. It's like just use pot odds and equity and just fold when you don't have like enough equity. If someone bets like 5x the size of the pot on the flop, just fold a ton. So that's what a lag is. Whales are the dream when you sit down at a table with a bunch of whales and they got giant stacks. Buckle your seatbelt. You can lose a ton, but you can also win a ton if you play correctly against them. A tag is a tight aggressive player. Tag is a good thing. Tight and aggressive is how you want to be playing. So this is often a compliment where lag isn't like necessarily a bad thing. Whale's a bad thing. Well, whale means you're not good, but there are plenty of good players that are loose aggressive. But tight aggressive is generally a very sound strategy. So these are normally good players. OMC stands for Old Man Coffee. This is the old 95-year-old guy sitting at the 1-3 table that only plays aces and kings. Super nit, very, very tight, only plays the nuts. What is a nit? Essentially same thing. Someone who's super tight, only plays the best hands. For both of these players, their VPIP is going to be very low. A lot of the time, you'll see nits limp a ton, and then they'll randomly raise pre-flop to like 10 big blinds, and they just have aces. They're also often weak and passive post-flop, so you can kind of run them over, especially when you pick up these tells where like, they're betting their big hands really big and their weak hands really small, or just checking all the time when they don't have a strong hand. You can just identify this very quickly and just run them over post-flop. But you always want to be adjusting to these player types and playing accordingly against them. Obviously, you're going to play against a whale differently than you're going to play against a nit or an OMC. So identifying these player types quickly and adjusting to them is pretty important. But this should be most of the definitions and like common lingo. Obviously, like while I'm streaming and things, feel free to ask me questions about what I'm talking about, or if I use a bunch of different lingo that I haven't included in here. Always feel free to ask, but these are kind of it. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.